Hi guys, I'm Woodcraft Hamster and I wanted to do a quick video today about starting out in bushcraft. Now it's a question I've been asked a few times by various people and really there's no one set answer. So what I thought I'd do, I'd talk a little bit about bushcraft in general, kind of how I got started out and what other people could possibly do if they want to get started bushcrafting. So to be honest, bushcraft means a lot of things to a lot of people. Now if you go onto discussion forums and things like that on the web, you know, so some people do have a very specific view of what bushcraft is, and that's perfectly fine, that's perfectly acceptable, but I have found bushcraft does mean different things to different people. Now when I got started out in bushcraft, unbeknowingly to me at the time, was when I was a kid, and I used to spend all my summer holidays and weekends out in the woodlands near where I lived, you know, building small fires, you know, playing around with penknives, that kind of thing. And back then that was just me running around having fun as a kid, but looking back you know, that was the very early beginnings of me getting into bushcraft. But for people who are maybe a little bit older who are looking to get into it, I suppose really the first question you need to ask yourself is what you want to get out of it. Now a lot of people envisage bushcraft as having these you know, lovely bushcraft knives and making fires out of you know, with a fire steel or bow drill or things like that, but it doesn't have to be, you don't have to go down that route, and really you just need to think a little bit about what you want. Now I'll be honest, you know, a lot of people I've met tend to gravitate towards using knives, using axes, saws, fire steels, and there is something sort of stereotypical or quintessential about bushcraft that does involve those items. And if you want to start out in bushcraft that way, there's no reason why not. You don't have to go out and spend loads of money. I mean, in theory you haven't got to go out and spend any money at all if you don't want to, depending on what you want to do. But in terms of, you know, if you want to buy yourself a bushcraft knife or a knife to practice bushcraft with, there are plenty of options out there. You have a look at a couple of my other videos, you know, you've got really high-end stuff, you've got really cheap stuff. If you are just starting out, my view would be buy yourself something cheap, cheap but reliable. Things like the Mora knife, the Mora clipper, get them for about £10 online. Really good quality knives. They'll do everything you need it to do. And certainly if you want to upgrade later on, that's fine, but basically, you know, a standard Mora knife will allow you to do everything you need to do in bushcraft, and it's a very good platform to learn proper safe knife skills. Things like a Swiss Army knife, I favour the Swiss Army knife Farmer, but there are loads of different models out there, and again for probably a little bit more money than a Mora, you get a folding pocket knife that will allow you to do pretty much most bushcraft jobs, aside from maybe battening or something like that. As far as fire steels go, you know, you can pick them up for £5 or £6 online, and again that in conjunction with either a striker that comes with it or a good knife, and you know, you've got a fire steel, you can start making fire. Saws and axes are slightly different, you know, they are a little bit more bespoke. And again, you can pick and choose out of the plethora of different manufacturers and makers out there to find what you like. But that's sort of the tools side of it, and you know, you can go out and buy things if you want to, by all means do, if that's your preference. But outside of that, you know, bushcraft for me personally is about being outdoors, enjoying nature. I'm quite lucky to have quite a bit of woodland local to me that I can get out to quite regularly. But again, if you want to spend a small amount of money, one thing I found really useful when I sort of started getting serious about bushcraft, when I realised it was bushcraft that I was actually doing, you can go online, places like Amazon, you know, Waterstones, the bookstore, things like that, and for very small amounts of money you can buy these little guides. I think Collins, the book publishing company, do quite a few of them, and there are others out there. But they do a really good tree identification guide, which is really useful, especially if you don't want to spend too much money. You know, you can walk around, wander around in the woods, you know, just enjoy being outdoors is first and foremost for me. But if you get one of these little guides, you can walk around. I can look at a tree behind me, so we've got a birch tree just behind me here that hopefully you can see. Now I know that's a birch, and that's because I do a lot of work with birch. But to be perfectly honest, you know, there's a lot of trees that I still can't identify accurately. So what I'll do, I'll sometimes bring the book out with me, I'll walk around, I'll see a tree that I don't quite recognise, and I'll take a good stab in the dark at it, and I think, you know, is that an alder, is that an oak, is it whatever? and then you can use the reference guide and you can find out what type of tree it is. You can also get mushroom identification books. That's a really good one if you're in a woodland that gets a lot of mushrooms growing. And again, you know, I'm not saying run out and try identifying mushrooms and eat them, because that's not particularly safe unless you know what you're doing. But it is a really good and interesting way to spend an afternoon in the woods. Find a mushroom that's growing on a tree, try and identify it, you know, off the top of your head first of all, and then just use your reference guide to basically find out whether you were right or not. And if you weren't right, it then hopefully will stick in your memory a little bit more, so you'll know it for the next time. So some of the other things you can do for bushcraft, I mean, again, if you're planning on just spending afternoons out in the woods, that's absolutely fine. If you want to start doing a little bit more, and maybe you want to start doing overnighters or 2 or 3 nights out in the woods, you need to maybe think about either a tent. Hammocks are very, very popular at the moment. It's something I use quite regularly. You can get bivvies, either specific bivvies with sort of hoops in them, so that it's almost like a miniature tent, or you can get bivvy bags where you just literally get into your sleeping bag, pull the bivvy bag over you, which keeps you dry in case it rains. And one of the other really important things for me for bushcraft are things like tarps or some sort of shelter. So I've got a couple of tarps, one quite big one if I'm going out with friends, and a small one if I'm just going out by myself. And you don't have to use this for staying out overnight. You can go out in the woods when the weather's a little bit inclement, and you can basically use it to keep a cover over your head while you're doing whatever you're doing while you're outdoors, whether you're doing a bit of carving, whether you're trying to practice your fire lighting, whether you want to just do a little brew or whatever. And one thing that I find really useful is to buy yourself a tarp. It doesn't have to be expensive. There's whole ranges from very, very cheap to ridiculously expensive and lightweight. But whatever you go for, I would suggest get a nice, you know, 30 or 40 feet's worth of paracords. Paracord's really, really useful for this kind of thing, as well as many, many other things. But basically, take some paracord, take a tarp, take it out to the woodslands, and basically play around with it, because what you don't want to do is go out for your first overnight trip and not really understand how your tarp works. Now, there are loads of websites out there covering what the phrase that I think has been coined is tarpology, and what that basically means is that, you know, out of a square or a rectangular tarp, there are hundreds of different ways of setting these things up. And what you want to do is find out what's best for you, whether you want an A-frame, whether you want to try and pitch it on a slope, whether you want to try and almost make like a little cave or a tent out of it, and there's loads of different ways of doing it, and I find it's a really enjoyable process to sit there. Sorry about the plane, guys, I think it's going right overhead at the moment. But yeah, play around with the tarp, find out what works for you and what works in certain situations. So you might find you've got 2 trees that are quite far apart, and you may need to rig that slightly differently to whether you've got when you've got 2 trees close together. You can play around with guy lines and tensioning things, and also on that note, also play around with knots as well. You know, there are loads and loads of different knots out there. Again, as I keep saying, you know, there's plenty of websites that will teach you which ones are good for certain things. But you know, you've got friction hitch knots, you've got bow lines. You know, there's loads and loads of different knots out there that work for different things. There are some that work really well with tarps, so you can tighten up your ridge lines. You can rig up a knot on a guy line so that it's adjustable, so you can move it up and down to give the right tension. And there's loads of things you can practice with spending very, very little money. But it will give you, you know, hours and hours and days of something to do while you're out in the woods practicing bushcraft. But really, I would say there's so many things that you can do whilst out in the woods, and as I said earlier, it really does depend on what you want to get out of it. So if you want to go out and do 6 or 7 day expeditions out in the middle of the woods, you know, you're absolutely fine to do that. What I would say is, whatever type of bushcraft you're planning on practicing, make sure that you learn the skills that are required for whatever it is you're doing well in advance. Don't go out on a 3 or 4 day trip with a pack full of kit that you've just bought but haven't learned the skills to use, because you're going to get into trouble. Now, I'm just out for the afternoon today. I've got a few bits of kit in my bag, just a couple of basic bits, but the most important bit of kit I think I've got on me today is my mobile phone. Now, I don't anticipate getting into any trouble out here, and I don't think that it's going to be needed, but I always carry a mobile phone with me. So if you are going out in the woods, make sure you've got a way of contacting people. But really, I mean, this video is hopefully will provoke a little bit of discussion, and I'm certainly hoping that it will do. So by all means, comments, questions, any thoughts that maybe you have about what bushcraft means to you, by all means drop them in the comments box below. More than happy to answer any questions about particular types of kit, or if someone is looking to get into bushcraft and they want a little bit of advice as to what I find useful, whether it's the more expensive kit, and especially the budget kit. There's loads of it out there, and there's a lot of kit that you can buy for very small sums of money that are absolutely perfect for bushcraft. You don't have to go out and spend loads and loads of money, as I've said. And if anybody wants any advice, or at least my advice and what I find works for me, by all means drop me a comment below. Feel free to hit subscribe if you'd like to see a little bit more of this, and I hope to see you all next time. Thanks guys.